Hello and welcome everybody to day 4 of Painting the Sphere. For those of you who might not yet be aware, my name is Mandy Tice. I am director of the School of Atelier Arts. I'm the former director of the Da Vinci Initiative. Some of you may have met me when I was working with the Da Vinci Initiative. And excuse me, I'm still fighting this cold, so please bear with me. I'm really excited today. We've been just kind of pacing and doing things the right way. And so yesterday, I'm just going to briefly review what we've done so far. So far in this painting, we have made a block-in of our sphere. We have created a background, ground plane, and front plane. We started mixing up our grisaille strings. Again, grisaille just means painting in black and white. We created a beautiful gradient from left to right, where it was getting lighter from left to right and also a little bit lighter top to bottom, because the further away something is from your light source, usually the darker it's going to be. However, in this case, our light is coming from this way, but because of this edge, and let me rotate this a little bit more, because of this edge here blocking the light, it's actually reversed what is normally true. And this side ended up being darker than this side because this wall of our box is blocking light on the side of our background. Okay, so that's what we have done approximately so far. And today, actually, let me take you back here. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to really focus on this ground plane here. We have a few tricks that we need to watch out for. This edge of the box is still casting a shadow diagonally here. So we're going to talk about that. We also have a cast shadow from the sphere blocking light from our ground plane. So we have two sneaky things happening that we need to be mindful of and that we'll definitely be talking about today. As you're coming in, it's so great to see so many of you here. Please give me a little hello. Let me know where you're checking in from. I always love to see you. And also make sure the chat is working. I am new to live streaming and I'm still on a big learning curve here on making sure that everything is working the way it's supposed to. Okay, so welcome, and we're going to kind of hop into it. I did want to address one thing from yesterday. We were talking about our environment, and yesterday it got very suddenly very sunny, and because we're working from natural light, it changed our light in our sphere quite a bit, and I had to block some reflected light that was bouncing light into the sphere. Now, today, I'm kind of wearing a chromatic sweater. All right, chroma just means intensely colored. And I did this for two reasons. One, I'm still sick and this is my comfort sweater. But two, I wanted to show you what happens when light around your subject, how the objects that are around your subject can change how you see your subject. So as I get my sleeve closer here, I want you to see what's happening, and I want you to let me know in the chat what you see. So I'm far away, and what happens as this chromatic sweater gets closer to my sphere. So away and closer, and away and closer. What is going on with the sphere? What difference do you see happening there when I am getting my chromatic sweater really close to my subject? And please let me know in the comments. I'm a little concerned because I don't see any comments yet. And okay, we got a comment. I'm like, uh-oh, am I doing something wrong? No, we got a comment. That's great. Hey, Ellen, thank you. And Ellen's saying, yes, there's reflected light. Okay. I got in so much trouble one time when I was training in the atelier. So I trained full-time in atelier for more than 5 years. And one day I thought I was just awesome. I got these brand new red pants and I loved them. And we were working from a model, and I happened to be sitting really close to the model. And my classmates were infuriated with me because my red pants were reflecting red onto the model, right? So if you ever find that, oh my gosh, I'm sitting down and something feels completely different, it might be your environment. So I just wanted to make a little point this morning to be mindful of your environment if you notice a big change in what you're observing. So thank you, Ellen. That's great. Excuse me. Okay. So today, again, as I mentioned, we're going to be working on the ground plane. I still have my palette. I was a very lazy student and I did not clean off my palette. This is in part because titanium white is slow to dry. And so I knew I could get another day out of this palette without worrying too much about it. We did mention that you can put your palettes in the freezer. Some people will put a few drops of clove oil on a rag and tape it to the lid of, a box and stick their palette in there. So it just depends on what your style is. So today after class, I'm definitely going to wipe it all down and mix new strings tomorrow. But I had enough paint. It is starting to kind of blend together because we've been working on gradients, right? Our whole background here was a gradient. So I still have my 5 steps. It's just they're slightly mushed together. Now, if you find that this is all one color, you need to scrape it off and remix your values. Keeping clean values is a key part of atelier painting, all right? Keeping clean notes. I talk about this all the time with my students. So we have our value 1, which is our white, our value 9, which is black, a 5, 3, and 7 in here, all right? And welcome, Deepti. I'm so glad to have you here from India. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about the theory of what we're seeing, what we know must be true based on what we understand light. And then we're going to talk about what we're actually seeing. And we're going to try to reconcile those two things. So atelier training is half what is it that you actually know and half what is it that you're actually seeing. And then the third step, of course, is organizing all that information in your crazy brain and spitting out something on canvas. So I don't understand, so many people come to me and they're like, oh, you're a painter, you make your living from painting, you must derpa all day, and it must be so much fun. And don't get me wrong, I love painting, I love teaching, those things are fun to me, but it's actually highly academic. We're doing a really basic project here, right? A sphere. And I want you to think about how much we have to think about in order to create a believable sphere. Art can be just as academic as mathematics or physics or any other subject that you study deeply. It's just that people unfairly give it this concept that it's not real academia, but it is. When you paint at the highest levels, you are using a lot of intellect, you're using a lot of knowledge, and you're using a lot of experience, and you can't paint realistically without those 3 things. Okay, so let's talk about the theory of what's happening on this ground plane. So I'm going to get a brush to be a little pointer here. Oh, actually, I have a little skewer. We'll use that for pointing. Okay, so, and I'm going to go maybe from the other side so I don't get my red arm in your way here. Okay, so we have the light coming from the upper left here. And so the light's coming from this direction, and the light is being interrupted by the sphere itself, which is what's causing a cast shadow. Now, there's 2 different kinds of shadows. We're going to talk way more in depth about this later on in this series, but there's a type of shadow where the object itself is turning away from the light. So our sphere, there's an exact place where the sphere is turning away from the light, creating a core shadow, and this side of the sphere is in shadow. That's a different kind of shadow of when an object is somehow interrupting the light. So you have your sphere here, you have the light coming from the upper left, but this shadow is a cast shadow because the sphere is interrupting the light from hitting this plane, all right? We have another cast shadow on our ground plane. Can anybody tell me in the chat? And I'm going to be quiet for like 2 whole minutes because if you've been following the series so far, you know how important I think it is that you are typing into the chat and making sure you're putting your guesses in there. If you're shy about typing, at least get a piece of paper and write these down because it's such an important part of your education to commit to a guess and then find out if you are correct. That's like learning 101, right? And it can be difficult to learn passively from videos, right? If I'm just yapping at you all the time, It's a very passive way of learning. The more active you are in your learning as a licensed K-12 teacher, I can tell you the research shows that the more active you are in your learning, the more you're going to learn. And the best way in this format with me live streaming to you is to, put on your big girl and big boy and big person pants. And even if you're a little intimidated, like actually type it out, give me your guesses. So going back to the question here, where is another cast shadow on the ground plane? The first example we discussed is that the sphere is interrupting the light and there's a cast shadow here. Does anybody have a guess where the other cast shadow is and what is casting it? I'm going to have a few sips of coffee while you guys have your typing fingers being busy. And Ellen's being a rock star, leading the way in education for the class here. Getting the typing in. I want to hear your guesses. Don't worry whether you're right or wrong. The important thing is that you're thinking about it and you're putting a guess out there. Thank you, Leola. Welcome back. It's good to see you again. All right. I know there's more than 2 people streaming today. Be brave, my friends. I want you to get the most out of this learning experience. I don't do these free classes very often, and this is a great opportunity for you to maximize your learning. Okay, so we have a couple guesses in the chat. And there's a lot going on with the sphere, but this here is a form shadow on the sphere. We're going to talk a lot more about that when we start painting the sphere. The other cast shadow, where an object is interrupting the light, is actually this side here is casting a diagonal shadow onto our ground plane here. All right. So we have a cast shadow on our ground plane, and it's kind of going in a diagonal. And I'm just trying to flatten this a little bit so that it's a little more clear in the video. Okay. And it looks like the point of view where you guys are seeing this right now is a little bit low. I'm going to raise you up just a touch because I want you to really be able to see the ground plane. Let's see if that works better. Okay, we're seeing a little bit more when you guys are higher. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, so we have a ground plane. Where did I put my pointer? I have very Mandied this. I've misplaced my pointer. We'll use this pencil instead. So we have the side of the box here casting a shadow in a diagonal across here. Now, yesterday we talked about how the closer something is to the light, the brighter it's going to be, and the further away from the light, the darker it's going to be. Well, there's something that happens with cast shadows and edges. So we have a similar rule, and it goes like this, and I'm going to say it a few times just to make sure you get it. So when the object, and let me rotate you back here. When you have a cast shadow, the part of the cast shadow that's closest to what's casting it is going to be the sharpest. And the further away it travels, the fuzzier that edge is going to be. The same is true if we look at the cast shadow that the sphere is casting down here. When the shadow is closest to our object, it is sharper. The further away from the object, this edge gets fuzzier. Okay, so these are 2 things that we want to be mindful of as we're painting this ground plane. Now, a lot of students are just going to show up and pick one color, maybe 2, maybe if they see the shadows here, and just paint this. But we have so much going on. We have this diagonal coming back through here. So I'm just going to briefly represent that with a pencil mark here. It's actually more of this angle. All right, so we have the cast shadow of the box over here somewhere. We have this cast shadow from the sphere. We have a plane where the front of the plane is closest to our light source, so it's going to be brighter. And as that plane goes back in space, it's actually getting darker. And then on top of that, we have this cast shadow with an edge that's sharp when it's close to the edge of the box that's casting it, and that this gets fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier as it gets away. We have a sharp edge on the cast shadow underneath the sphere where it's close to the sphere, but this part of the shadow is actually going to end up having a fuzzy edge over here, all right, because this part is so far away from where the object is originally casting the shadow. So are there any questions about how soft, like how hard and soft edges work when you're working with cast shadows? I have this like one random curl here. Let's get this out of the way. I feel like alfalfa. Okay, so excuse me. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I need to come up with a few ideas, and I want to do the thinking before I put my brush to canvas. All right, so I want to come up with a few ideas of what the different values are. So I see a great question in the chat. What about near reflections? How does I assume you're talking about the cast shadow if they're near reflections. So something I'm going to go way more in depth than that actually tomorrow, Peter. That's a good tomorrow, or whenever we start actually painting. Well, I guess I am going to be painting this today. All right, I'm going to go on a side quest and answer this question. Okay, so the question that Peter's asking is, how about near reflections? What I think he's talking about is if we're looking at this cast shadow here, and we have some reflected light bouncing into this sphere here, but we also have, light hitting this edge and bouncing into our cast shadow. That's in part what's creating this soft edge, is that there's a lot more opportunity for bouncing light to be coming way over here than there is when it's tucked under our object. The same is true when we're looking at this side of the box casting a shadow here. When we're closer to the side of the box, there isn't as much space and time for light to get bouncy. But by the time we get all the way over here, the light can be bouncing off the sphere and into here. It can be bouncing off the front plane and back. It can be bouncing, all the way to this edge and back. So the further you are from the object casting the shadow, the more reflected light and bouncing light is getting into your cast shadow. And that's what is actually creating the softness of the edge there. So that's a good clarifying question. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to ask you guys to give me some guesses on a few things. So first of all, I want you to give me a guess on what color this part, where I'm putting this X right here, we'll call this our first guess. What value, with 1 being pure white and 9 being our pure black, what value would be here where this X is? Let me know in the chat. And shout out to Leola for being extra brave. I'm so proud of you. And Ellen, I'm glad that you learned something new today. If you hadn't heard that explanation before, there's so much to learn about light and shadow. And, this whole project is about light and shadow. By the time we finish the sphere, you are going to have such a nuanced understanding of how light reveals form, because there's so much that you really need to know in order for the sphere to look like a sphere at the end. People think, it's just a sphere, and they treat it like a side project, like a not very important project. But if you take this project very seriously, you will learn more about form than any other project that you can do. All right, so I see some great guesses in the chat. Thank you from Peter. Thank you, Sheila. Sheila, that's awesome. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And Leola, excellent. So yes, everybody's correct that it's in the lighter end of the sphere. Now, we have to consider a few things, because on the one hand, this is pretty bright. It's one of the brighter things. It's certainly the brightest area of this entire ground plane, right? But we also have to look in context of the whole. If I use my number 1 where this X is, I can't go any brighter than my pure white. But when I get to my sphere, I have this little highlight, right, on my sphere here. And if I use up my number 1 here, then I can't make my highlight look brighter than that, right? I've used up the full extent of my range. So it is very bright, but I would call it somewhere between a 1 and a 2, right? I don't want to use up my pure white when I want to save it for my highlight, but I definitely want to show that this is a brighter area. So I'm thinking like a 1.5 here. So anybody who put a 1 or a 2, excellent job. Kudos to you. Thumbs up. All right. So I'm thinking like 1.5 here. Now, we said that the closer we are to the light source, the brighter it is, and the further away from the light source, the darker it is. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to be a big jump. So if I were to put a value at the X now, so let me erase my old X. Okay, what about this X over here? We said that this, and I'm just going to keep our note. We said this is maybe a 1.5 here. All right. What would this be if the light source is coming from the upper left? Would it be lighter than this? Darker than a 1.5? The same as a 1.5? Okay, so put your guesses in there. I'm going to take a sip of coffee before I like hack up into your ears here. I'm so over this cold. Okay, I'm seeing some great guesses. I'm seeing some knowledge there. It's definitely a little bit darker. So the real question is how much darker is it actually going to get? So it is further away from the light source, but keep in mind that you guys are seeing this through a screen. And when I'm looking at the screen versus looking at it here, the way that the computer is showing you this, it's still showing this side over here fairly bright. It's showing it brighter than I'm actually seeing it in real life. And so sometimes what happens is that we have to rely a little bit on what we know must be true in addition to what we're observing. So we know that this side is further away from the light source than this side. So we know it has to be, even if it's just a little bit, a tiny bit darker. So I'm going to give this a number 2 over here. And if you're confused because it's not what you're seeing, keep in mind that unfortunately working with technology, it often unifies really light lights into just one value. But if you have set up your own sphere at home by now, and if you haven't already, I encourage you to just set up a sphere and look at it while you're going through the series with me. We're going to be doing this probably for at least another week. That, you have something to observe to supplement what I am telling you is true. I don't expect you guys to be in a cult and blindly believe everything that I tell you, but I do want to help you understand how light functions and that there is going to be a little bit of discrepancy in how the technology is translating this visual information to you. Excuse me. Oh, and Ellen says her light bulb's almost dry. Excellent. If anybody's joining us that hasn't seen the first few episodes, this is episode 4. We've been meeting every day at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this week, and we'll continue to do so throughout this project. If you go back to the very first episode, I go through the process that you need to know in order to set up this project. Excellent. Excuse me. I need like a good cough, so just give me like a 5-second time out here. Oh my goodness. Okay. All right, I'm back. All right, so what I want to do now is I've made an idea from left to right, but I also want to consider what's going on from front to back. The front part of our plane is closer to our light source than the back part of the plane, right? So if I want to know, excuse me. So the theory is that the further away something is from the light source, the darker it's going to be. So if I want to know what this new X, I'm going to put this X back here. So we're now talking about this area back here. What number would you give that? And this is where it starts to get tricky because we need to relate it to what we put the background in here at, right? And I believe from yesterday, we said this was maybe a 4 or 5, just slightly lighter than a 5, I think is what we settled on here. And we know that this has to be lighter than that, but we know it has to be darker than our 2. So what are our thoughts here for our new X? Oh, Peter has a suggestion with putting an onion in the studio to keep down the cough. I have never heard of that. Has anybody else ever heard of that before? That's fascinating. I'm willing to try anything. I'm desperate to just get this cough to go away. It's been weeks. Like I've been sick since mid-December. Okay, so I see one guess of a 5, and it's not a terrible guess because 5 is darker than 2. It's just that this background here, I believe we put it like a 4.5 to 5, and this X is lighter than that. So we need to be at least lighter than a 4.5 here. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that either, Ellen. But Shelia and Leola have. Shelia and Leola have. That's amazing. I'm gonna have to try this. I'm gonna definitely cut up onions. My whole house is gonna have like halved onions everywhere. Okay, so I see some guesses of a 3, and I think that's probably pretty good. Maybe even a 3.5. You know, as a ground plane meets a back plane, the tendency for students is to be like, oh my gosh, there's a change, and they tend to really exaggerate it. But it doesn't have to be a big value jump between the ground plane and the back plane for it to actually read. So I'm going to put this as a 3, maybe a 3.5 by the time it gets back there. I'm going to say 3.5 because when I'm looking at it, if this part is a 4, there's actually not a huge jump from the very backmost part of the ground plane to the bottommost part of our back plane. Okay, so do you see how we've kind of made a plan for ourselves? Like if you just take the time to stop and think, then you can have a plan, and now it's not so intimidating to start putting paint down, right? We have a general plan. We're going to start at a 1.5, work our way lately a little bit darker to the 2, and then from front to back, work from the 2 to a 3.5, right? So that's not so bad here. Now, we also need to think about our cast shadows here, right? Now, what I'm seeing, which is really interesting to me, actually, I'm not going to tell you what I'm seeing. I'm going to ask you what you're seeing. So what about the middle of this cast shadow that the wall is casting way over here? So I'm talking like this area right here. Sorry, it's hard to point without creating a shadow myself. This area here, like the deep part of our shadow. And I want to ask you a key question. Is it different from the background? And writing down numbers is perfectly legitimate. Some artists will actually make a little sketch before they paint anything and just put the numbers of where they think everything is, especially when they're painting in grisaille. Excuse me. So sometimes what's really crazy is that we have to ask ourselves, is it lighter, is it darker, or is it the same, right, as that background? And so I'm seeing some specific guesses. I see an 8 in the chat. And I think that's actually pretty good. Now, I'm trying to look on the screen to make sure what I'm seeing on the screen is similar. But when you look at this part and you look at this part, squint your eyes, I'm not seeing a difference. So I'm getting a samesies. And I believe yesterday we made this about an 8. And so I think whoever put 8 in the chat, who put a 8? Ellen, I think you are absolutely right here. So this part of the shadow is an 8. And guess what? It's just going to dissolve in here. And that's scary to some students, right? Oh, but how will they know that it's a ground plane and not a back plane? Well, this side is going to do all the heavy lifting. We're going to get a difference between the back plane and the ground plane here. Oops, I just stuck my finger right in wet paint. we are going to get the difference here, and it's just going to imply for our eye all the way across. And so this is actually just going to completely dissolve. We're not going to see a difference between this back plane and this ground plane on this one area. And then as it meets our 1.5 over here, it's going to have a sharp edge that dissolves, right? So this 8 is going to be a little crisper up front, and it's going to dissolve into, this lit part of our ground plane. The same is true underneath our sphere. This is probably even an 8.5. It's even darker here because there's less light being able to bounce here than over here. So when you squint your eyes, do you see how you could even make an argument that it's a true 9 right underneath the sphere? But we'll call it an 8.5. And then if we want to put a tiny bit of 9 in there, it gives us some space. And Leola's saying, yeah, once I squinted, I didn't see a difference. Exactly, right? Squinting is your best friend when you're trying to evaluate values. And actually, as a little timeout while we're talking about that, and especially while we're talking about squinting, did you know that there is a way of squinting that Atelier trained artists use that's different than regular squinting? And so I want to teach you about the Atelier squint. So imagine that you're a 3-year-old child and you don't understand that if you think that if you just close your eyes tight enough that nobody can see you, right? You know how they do that thing? They were like, "Argh!" Like that super closed eye thing. So do the thing where you're squinting your eyes so tight that you think you're a 3-year-old child that became invisible, because if you can't see them, they can't see you. So like the tightest you can close your eyes. And then I want you to just barely open them so you see pieces of your eyelash, right? Like, so it's so squinty that like it almost feels like there's a screen in front of your eyes because your eyelashes are in your way. All right, that's the Atelier squint. That is going to help you accurately or more accurately see values than your typical squint, which is kind of like a, this squint isn't going to help you as much as the looking through your eyelash squint. Do you see the difference in my face? Atelier squint, regular squint, Atelier squint, right? They're different. But the Atelier squint just makes it more obvious. I don't know why it works. I don't know the physics behind why it works, but it does help you see the difference in the values. Okay, who knew that they were going to learn how to squint today? Like you woke up this morning being like, you know what? I'm just not happy with my squint. I'm going to do something different today. All right, I need those onions ASAP. All right. Oh, excellent. So Leola's saying that she learned it in middle school, but didn't know that that's what it's called. I've never heard anybody call it the Atelier squint. It's just that the way that they squint in ateliers. I guess I just called it the Atelier squint because I'm trying to differentiate it from the other squints. But I just made that up. There isn't a name for it specifically that I know of, other than I wanted to differentiate it for you. All right. Okay, so because sometimes my students say, I did squint, but I can tell that they're not seeing it, and it's because they're not squinting enough. You have to like super squint. Maybe that's what I'll call it, a super squint. Okay, so we did a lot of planning here. So I usually prefer to always paint my shadows first and then work towards my lights. So that's what I'm going to do today. And I'm going to start with this shadow over here because it's not nearly as important as the cast shadow over here. So when you're starting your day, give yourself an easy entry point into your painting day. Don't try to tackle the hardest thing first. Like give your eyes and mind a little warm up. So this is my 8, and I'm just going to put a little down to make sure that it's close. It's feeling just a touch on the dark side there. There we go. And here's a scary part for students, but I'm just going to get rid of that line. If there's no difference, there's no difference. This is part of creating an atmosphere for your sphere that's really believable. And if you ever have paintings at the end that you feel are cartoony, it's because you're trying to over describe things that your eye is not actually seeing. Our eye is not actually seeing a difference between this part of our painting and the ground plane of our painting. But if you force that to exist, that's when you start going into cartoony land. Okay, and it's a little sharper on the left side, we said. And some of that sharpness is going to come when we paint the light side. And then it gets a little fuzzier. So how do you paint fuzziness? Well, it's really a soft edge. And the way that you paint a soft edge is basically a gradient that's really skinny, right? So this is a gradient up here, left to right. And a soft edge is just as if we would take this whole thing and compress it into a half an inch or so, right? So think of a soft edge as a gradient and you won't get so overwhelmed by them. All right, so in order to make a gradient, I need to go just a little bit lighter. And again, I'm not getting too close to my sphere because this brush is way too big and it's going to ruin my sphere shape, which we've already talked a lot about is sacred. If you lose the outline of your sphere, it's really, really bad for you. All right, so Peter's asking a question about the folds of the cloth. I know that these folds are there, but I'm completely ignoring them. I don't want to get distracted by these little things. If I wasn't even really planning on painting the folds. I just really liked this color of cloth for my background. And I didn't have paper that I would normally use to put back there. So there is like a little bit of a fold here that you can show. But I find even if I do intend to paint the folds, to paint the big ideas first. And the big ideas are what are the gradients, where are the soft edges, what are the values, and then on a second pass, put in the little details of the fold. So even if I were to paint the folds, and that'll be something I'll decide on a second pass, not the first pass, I'd still start the painting the same way that I'm showing you now. So that's a good question. I probably should have just gone out and found some paper. That was the color I wanted to eliminate that confusion for students. All right, and again, it's just like a little gradient, right? And it's a softer edge. The gradient is wider where it's softer and skinnier where it's sharper. And then we're eventually, so we said the front of this is 1.5, but remember as it goes back, it's also getting darker. So it's probably going back to, if this was a 1.5 and this was a 2 and the 2 went back a step and a half, if we took 1.5 back a step and a half, it would probably be a 3. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my 3 here. So do you see how the gradient is sharper here and getting a little softer as it pulls away? Now I can refine this a little bit. Just smoothing this transition a little bit. I'm wiping my brush and I'm working from both sides. Sometimes I'm working from the dark side to the light side, and sometimes I'm working from the light side into the dark side. And I'm just trying to create an edge that feels like it gets fuzzier as it gets away from the light source there. So do you guys see how I'm making that transition? I also want to make sure that I'm getting my value 3 back here cleanly. And it's also working its way to a 1.5 by the very front. This is my 1.5 on the front. And of course, we want it to transition into that soft edge here. All right, so do you see how we're creating this illusion going from light to dark having the cast shadow, and then changing the edge on the cast shadow from sharp to soft. That's a whole lot of thinking to do with just a few inches of canvas space. Do you see how intellectual this process can actually be? Okay, so now there's something I need to check on top of all that. So, we have to think about the gradient from front to back. We have to think about the edge from sharp to soft, but we also have to make sure that overall, when we do our magic squint or our atelier squint, that even though this is a softer edge, it starts sharp and it gets softer. Even though that's true, we need to make sure that the angle is reading accurately. And right now, when I squint my eyes, my angle is reading upwards like this. And when I'm looking at my subject, it's actually a little bit more downwards, right? The angle's a little shallower than the way it's currently reading. So not only do we have to worry about the gradient front to back, the edge quality, we have to make sure that the drawing is accurate. And it's so hard for students, especially when they're learning, to see the accurate direction of a soft edge, right? And you really need your super squint in order to be able to do it. So I'm going to change the angle down by going back to my 8 here. That's not quite my 8. All right. And I'm pulling the dark part down just a little bit more to change that angle. And of course, I've messed up my soft edge a little bit. So now I need to go transition this edge a little better. And I think I still need to pull that back dark down a touch. It looks like I went too dark. Now here's the part where you do not panic. All right, I went a little too dark here. Be methodical. If you overshoot your dark, you need to go back and slightly overshoot your light in order to bring it down to the right value, because it's going to pick up that dark on the canvas. And now I need to soften that edge a little bit more. So edges in particular are a very push-pull phenomenon. I want it sharper here, and I want it to get fuzzier as it goes down. But I also need to maintain the overall angle of it. I still feel like it's too steep. Every time I soften it, I'm softening it up, and really I need to soften it down because I'm just going back and forth and reproducing the same angle over and over again. So this time I'm going to soften it down. People think, oh, it's just a background, I'll throw something down. But the background needs just as much attention and affection from you as a painter as every other part of your painting. Okay, I'm starting to feel that. I still feel like the angle's slightly high. So going back to bringing this back down just a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so push and pull, push and pull. Now I want to show you something that's happening on my palette that you need to be really mindful of, which is, do you see how, especially when you're working in gradients, that the dark creeps across your piles? And so what I started with, I had a 1, a 9, a 5, a 3, and a 7, but now it's like a 9, 8, 7, 6, 1, right? Do you see how I've lost my light values in here? So what I really need to do is take a time out and reestablish my values on my palette. Otherwise, my whole painting is going to start skewing dark. All right. So, oh, and absolutely spending time. So there's a comment in the chat about spending time defining the edges of the drawing. Edges are amazing. And in fact, if you really want to get into it, there's actually no such thing as a line. It's only one value meeting another value that creates the illusion of a line. When you're painting in grisaille, when you're painting in full color, it's one value chroma hue color meeting another value chroma hue color. And an essential part of that meeting is how soft or hard that edge is, right? And that's something that people often don't consider. They'll make all hard edges and then have a painting at the end and wonder why it looks cartoony, right? Because they're not observing how those two colors are meeting. They're just seeing that they meet and using a line to show that, instead of actually observing the phenomena of how hard or soft that edge is when they meet. Okay, so I need to remix my palette a little bit. Oh my gosh, it's almost 10 o'clock already. I thought we were going to do this whole ground plane, and we've done a third of a ground plane, right? So actually, because I didn't realize how late we are, and I have to remix a palette, and that's going to take 5 or 10 minutes, that I'm going to call it here, and then I can remix my palette before we start tomorrow. But does anybody have any questions about today's lesson? I hope that your big takeaway is understanding your edges and understanding how to squint to find your edges, because when you have a soft edge, sometimes it's hard to tell what the angle of that edge actually is. Oh my goodness. I can't, that just flew by today. I thought seriously we were at halfway. I thought I still had a half hour to work. Okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to have a bunch of cut up onions, and I'm going to have a fresh palette mixed up, and we're going to be covering basically a similar concept. It's a little bit different when we get to see the whole cast shadow. Here we only had a part of the cast shadow, so we'll really get to review and reiterate what we talked about today when we work on this cast shadow tomorrow. So there's a question in the chat. Do you paint in a painterly fashion? Do you not blend? I do blends, but I care more about it reading cleanly. I was also painting, this is a good question, Peter. I was also painting with a large brush, and I'm going to get my smaller brush when I'm ready to take it closer to the edge of my sphere. And when I have my small brush, I'm also going to clean up some of these, where the edge is a little abrupt. With a softer brush, I can make that more subtle. So it's really a brushwork issue there, not a matter of whether I'm painting painterly or tight. I do find that in order to make a really tight painting, and this is different for everybody. I have never met two artists that have the same paint handling skills, right? But for me, I find that if I want to make a super tight painting, that I need a second or a third pass on it. That this is essentially would act as an underpainting, and that each additional pass, I could get it tighter and tighter. So a great question from Laura Oraz. Are you going through the weekend or starting on Monday? So I'm going to take the weekend off. So this will be a Monday and Friday class, and I'll keep showing up every Monday through Friday until this project is done. Oh, I'm so glad that you learned a lot, Leola. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I really enjoy how this class is developing. I love the rapport we're getting in the chat. If you are watching and you haven't jumped into the chat yet, I encourage you to do so. It really does help your learning and will accelerate what you get out of this class. So thank you everybody for coming, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.